Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the GRC and Cybersecurity podcast. In today's episode, we've got a really special guest, Rory, and we're going to talk about how his career in cyber, setting up a charity, and how he helps victims of cybercrimes.
Hi Rory, can you introduce yourself to the listeners and tell a little bit about the company that you work for?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rory Innes. I am the founder and CEO of the Cyber Helpline. The Cyber Helpline is a charity, but it's really a movement by the cybersecurity community to step in and fill the gap in support for victims of cybercrime. So we essentially connect volunteer cybersecurity experts with individuals and families who have experienced something malicious online, so we can help them recover and get safe online again.
Fantastic. So before we go any further, one of the things I always like to ask is, what do you get up to outside of work? Have you got any hobbies, any things you do in your spare time?
Yeah, lots. I'm a rugby coach, so I played rugby for a long time. I'm now too old. And it hurts too much, so I've transitioned into coaching, which I've really been enjoying. I've also got 4 children, and that keeps me pretty busy.
Yeah.
I'm just at the point where they are starting to have their own clubs and hobbies, and so that's logistically quite interesting. But yeah, across the Cyber Helpline, rugby, and the kids, that keeps me pretty busy.
Yeah, sounds like you've got a lot going on. So, you kind of mentioned your role briefly, but can you talk about, I guess, your current role, how you got into it, and then also a bit of your history in security? So how did you get to founding this charity? Where did you start off in security?
Yeah, so I guess my journey's been relatively interesting. So I joined a cybersecurity, information security firm as a student placement back in 2002. Knew absolutely nothing about information security, cybersecurity, or really technology at that point at all. And that organisation grew really quickly. It had a professional services arm, and it had just built a multi-tenant SOC, and it was providing SOC services. It grew really quickly, was acquired by SecureWorks, and then a year later Dell acquired SecureWorks. And so had always been in that managed security services space. And then when I left Dell, I went to this organisation to create a cybersecurity practice. And that was a professional services cybersecurity practice, a lot of instant response. But they also had this really interesting part of the business, which was private clients. So they had, through various ways, lots of private clients, so wealthy individuals who they were providing services to. And as I was building up this professional services firm for the business-to-business side, we kept getting these requests in the private client side. And that's where I really got my first exposure to what does it look like helping individuals and their family environments rather than businesses. And as I was kind of, building services for these private clients, I kind of realised that not enough was being done just for the general public. If you didn't have a lot of money, you couldn't afford cybersecurity experts and get the help you needed. And the more I looked into that, the more I realised the gap in support for victims is really large. And just as an example, we think less than 30% of people who've experienced cybercrime, digital scams, online harm, report to the police. And those who do report to the police, 87% of them get no further action. So there's just this big gap in support. So at that point, having worked in the cybersecurity industry for a long time and realizing that, people are really good. They volunteer, they do all sorts of, fundraising for great causes. But there wasn't a vehicle for people to use their skills to help fill this gap. And so I guess that was the genesis of the idea that formed the charity. Why don't we set up a charity that allows the cybersecurity community to do volunteering, use their skills and try and plug some of this gap. So I absolutely had no plans, one, to get into cybersecurity, or two, to find a charity, but both have happened that have dominated my kind of career journey to date.
Amazing. And what did you study out of interest?
I studied marketing. Well, I did a degree in marketing management, and then I did my professional postgraduate in marketing and was a chartered marketer for a long time. So my role was really on that commercial side. And as I kind of grew, a lot of my work was around sales, around marketing, and around kind of expansion strategy. And what I find really interesting is I used to find that really daunting, because I wasn't technical in a really technical industry. But what I've actually realised is that having to work really hard to be able to understand the concepts of the technology and the cybersecurity and be able to explain them really simply, which is the way I could understand them, has really helped me in my career in terms of progression and kind of management, but also in terms of the people that we deal with at the charity are the general public. You know, you have to be able to explain the technologies, the threats, the actions in a really simple, plain English way. And I think that has been really good preparation for what we've essentially built in the charity, which is a instant response service for the public.
Yeah, I mean, so I had last year I had my identity stolen, and look, I work in this industry, and it was one of those things where it was like, and it took me a while to figure out how it happened, and I kind of was okay with like figuring out and dealing with all the fallout from them opening like 9 bank accounts in my name.
Yeah.
On the back of it, and you think like, if that happened to, like, for example, my parents, I don't think they would have been able to figure out the series of things where they get the information from, how they've pieced it together, what they've done, and the clever things where they ring you on follow-up fake things that look like they're from HSBC and all these other things. And it's like, people haven't got a clue. And I work in this industry and it happened to me. And you kind of like...
Yeah, there's this kind of almost fake notion that because you're technical or because you work in cybersecurity or information security, that you somehow know how to deal with identity theft and cyber stalking and revenge porn and all of these issues. And you just don't. It's a completely different field. And when we started the charity, we had prepared for these different types of attacks that we might see that I had seen previously. And what you prepare for is the kind of hacked accounts and the malicious software, the ransomware, scams. But actually, if you look at what people are facing online, it's online harassment, it's cyber stalking, it's revenge porn, it's sextortion. And so these are really human issues wrapped up in technology. And so even though we take cybersecurity experts and they have that grounding in the tech and in the kind of industry, we still have to teach them what is the response pathway for cyber stalking. How do you keep someone safe? How do you engage with the police? How do you engage with a stalking charity? And what does that look like? Because although you understand the technical concepts, you don't understand the plan for how you get this individual somewhere safe. And so a lot of the last 7 years, and bear in mind we've dealt with 55, 60,000 cases. We're opening around 2,500, 3,000 cases a month. A lot of the work we have done is, how do you respond to these attacks that individuals are facing? What is the most effective way to get them safe and limit the damage? And continually evolving those instant response procedures as we see new tradecraft from criminals or adversaries, which sometimes is partners, school friends, parents, whoever it might be who's a threat actor. So that's also been really interesting, because I think we've developed this really interesting view of what is the threat landscape for an individual rather than for a business.
Great. So I guess before we jump into a little bit about the charity, so what are you kind of spending the most time at the moment? Is there a particular, I guess, area where you're investing a lot of time? What is it that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, what nobody really tells you when you found a charity is that you will just spend all of your time begging for money, and you think it's going to be, you're going to be helping lots of people, and you're going to be building it all out, which is absolutely what we do. But a big focus has been, how do we get the funding so that we can deliver the service? And just as an example, we have close to 150 volunteers from across the cyber industry. We now have 11 staff, and each volunteer who's on our helpline will cost us around £750 a year, because you've got to give them a help desk license and a calling solution, insurance, a DBS check. So, people want to volunteer, but we need to find the funds so we can pay for them to be here to help people. But I think we also have some really interesting projects that we're looking at. One of those is just always growth. So how do we deal with the demand that we're seeing? So we have around 25, 30,000 people visiting our self-help service each month. We have around 2,500, 3,000 people opening cases, either through our chatbot or with our help desk. And that is growing quickly. So a lot of our focus is, how do we help those people? How do we grow to help more? And how do we keep both our volunteers and the service users safe? But what we're also realizing is that we've got a really big data set. So we understand really well, how are people being attacked? What are the different attack types? What is the tradecraft within those attack types? We're also seeing a lot of threat intelligence, malicious phone numbers, emails, Bitcoin wallet addresses, social media profiles. And so what we're really focused on right now is, how do we get our threat intelligence capability right? And in particular, so that we can do information sharing with organizations that need that data, either to pursue criminals or to understand these attacks and think about how they might regulate to keep people safe. So I think growth, I think threat intelligence, and then the last thing I think we're focused on more and more as we get bigger is, how do we represent individuals? So a lot of the victims in this space don't really have a voice. They're not really being helped. They're not in the criminal justice system getting justice. But we're starting to understand the problems and challenges and the impact. So how can we be a voice for those victims and try and push for change, whether that's law, whether that's regulation, whether it's services. And so I think we're thinking a lot more about, how do we push forward and make things safer online.
Yeah, I can imagine it's kind of one of those things that's just like, there's so much going on, and the scale of it's just, and things like new technology like AI is making this thing so much easier to do. I saw the other day, like, there's not the dark web, you can buy versions of GPTs that can do all kinds of crazy things that are not expensive, and like, what the access to do some pretty bad stuff is really not that hard anymore, and you don't really have to look that far for it.
And the expectation also is that what cyber criminals are doing is really technical, and actually that is not the case, because if you are trying to target an individual, you're probably going to use email or a phone or a social media profile. If you look at sextortion, tricking people into a sex act and then asking for a ransom, is simply having a social media account and phoning someone. And I think what we are seeing, though, is the use of whether it's large language models, AI, to be able to productionize that and hit more people faster and have much more credibility and situational fluency when you're targeting those individuals. And I think there's a flip side to that too, which is, we can use those tools in how we help individuals. And so we have a chatbot that we've built that has a diagnosis engine plugged in. So we've built a decision-making engine which can say, hey, from this description from the user, this is what we think this individual has faced in terms of the crime types. And then we can send them for some immediate help. Actually, we're doing some early work now on LLMs and AI and how we might be more effective with that diagnosis. And so hopefully it's an arms race, but we're both in it with roughly the same tools. Yep.
So, Rory, how can people get involved and learn more about a charity or even help towards raising funds or getting involved in volunteering?
There's lots of ways that people can help. For some people, they have the time to volunteer, and we're always on the lookout for volunteers. And that might be people who are on the front line dealing with the public and helping them through those issues. That might be more technical people with specialist skills who can help us understand certain types of attacks and investigate them. But we're also just an organisation. We need people with legal experience, with HR experience, with marketing experience, and fundraising experience. And so if you're interested in the mission and you'd like to help, and come and talk to us, and we can most likely find a home for you, because there's a lot of work to do. For those that don't have the time, I think there are lots of ways to help, and that might be just raising awareness of the service, liking and sharing on social media. The more people know about us, the more victims can come and use the service. But also fundraising. So we have lots of fundraisers throughout the year, but we have a big focus in Cybersecurity Awareness Month in October, where lots of organisations in the industry tend to take on a challenge. And it might be a Tough Mudder, a cycle, a sponsored walk. It might be a bake sale in the office. But it really helps us raise funds and awareness at the same time that can then, we can then channel into more volunteers on the helpline. So whether it's volunteering, whether it's fundraising, whether it's sending people our way when they need help, all of that really helps us progress.
Amazing. And like I say, it's great for, I guess there's lots of different ways that people can get involved. So let's jump a little bit into the specialist questions. So let's talk a little bit about kind of incidents. So can you explain to the listeners, kind of summarise the various types of incidents that you, I guess, encounter through the cyber helpline?
Yeah, so I guess if you look at all of the, 60,000 cases that we've taken over the last 7 years or so, I would say that about 20 to 25% of those are in the online harassment and cyber stalking space. And that, if you look at cyber stalking in particular, that is where an individual has become obsessed with that victim online, and they are using a whole range of behaviours to target that individual for a range of different motivations. It might be getting into a relationship, it might be revenge, it might be a sexual encounter thereafter, but they dominate that victim's life through contact online, through mentioning, sending gifts to their home, a whole range of things that happen. And in those examples, it can be just someone who's seen them on social media. So it's just a stranger who's all of a sudden become obsessed with that individual and launches an attack. It can be ex-partners, and so it can be people who have an intimate knowledge of that individual. They might know their passwords, they might have lived together, and they have access to the Alexa and the Ring doorbell and all the other kind of technologies they have at home. So a lot of the time on that side, it's about understanding as much as we can about the individual who is targeting them, what their capability is, where they might be, and what physical threat they present, and then looking at the digital footprint of that service user and saying, okay, here's how they're targeting you now. How can we, over time, deal with the stalking threat but get you safe and recover? So that online harassment, cyber stalking side is a good chunk of what we do. We also then see a lot of sextortion. We see a lot of revenge porn. So intimate images being used, either shared online or being used as a ransom. So if you don't give us £2,000 by next week, we will send this to everyone on your LinkedIn profile and everyone on your Facebook profile. And just imagine in that scenario, the terror. And we've obviously seen a story in the Houses of Parliament with MPs being targeted. If you've seen that story where they've been text images and images have been shared and then used to gather extra information. So these kind of stalking, harassment, sextortion, and revenge porn areas really common. The other side we see a lot is scams. And these might be investment scams, particularly virtual currency investment scams. We see a lot. We see a lot of job fraud, particularly targeting people who've been struggling in the cost of living crisis. So trying to earn more money, trying to get a job if they don't have one, and being tricked out of money to either apply for a job or sometimes thinking they're doing a job and actually doing work but not getting paid, and it was a fake job the whole time. So we have that kind of fraud and scams bucket, which is probably a good third of what we do. The rest really covers over 45 different types of attacks. That might be ransomware. It might be various kind of forms of malicious software, hacked accounts, being impersonated online, catfishing, you name it. People will think up ways to target individuals online. And I would say that money is maybe half of the motivation for all of the attacks. The rest are some sort of relationship, human kind of interaction motivation, like revenge, for example.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I mean, in your experience, obviously these people are reaching out to you. Like, what are the common actions they take? Is it they first come to you? Do they go somewhere else and come to you? Like, what do they do when these things happen?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question because it depends what's happened. If they've lost money, quite often they've gone to the police first, or they've gone to the platform first where they've been scammed. And usually in both of those examples, they haven't heard back from the social media platform, they haven't heard back from the police, and so they find us and say, look, we've reported this, but we need to take some action. And you've also got to remember, if you've been scammed, just because you've lost money, that doesn't mean that's all of the attack. You may have lost money because you've been phished, they've got access to your device, they've then accessed your bank account, and then you've got to have a think about, what is my other exposure? What else was on that laptop? Are they still in there? Identity theft and recovery scams. What are the other things that might happen down the line? I think, though, for the majority of people who come to us, they haven't been anywhere else first. And for a lot of people, they don't really understand what's happened. And so you've got to remember that if you've just been targeted and you're not technical, you don't understand how these scams work, and you're in the heat of the moment of you've just given someone your pension or a naked image and now you're being threatened, the stress and the mental health load of that is really intense. So a big part of our first job is to understand what's happened. So obviously we go through questioning, we understand what the symptoms are, we do a kind of initial investigation, but we're also trying to work out where is the individual, where are they in terms of their mental health? Are they ready to proceed? Is it safe to proceed? And who else needs to be involved before we can make decisions? Because just as an example, if you have a cyber stalker and they've got access to your email account, blocking that email account can just make it worse. So removing them from that email account can make them do more risky things. So often we have to have the right environment in place before we can progress. And then it's also at that point understanding the threat actor. What are they trying to achieve? What are they likely to do next? And what do we need to prepare for? And a part of that is often looking at the digital footprint of the individual. What is their likely exposure and what else might happen? And then really working through a procedure for each of those different types of attacks. So it's really varied because the attacks are so varied. The methodologies, the pace in which we can work these cases, who's involved, mental health services, stalking charities, police officers, is different depending on what's happened and what the individual is trying to get as their outcome.
Yeah, and I can only speak from my own experience with it. And it was digital footprint was the literal thing. I was like, where is this? Where did they get this data from? And I just went back and back and back to something. I was like, what a numpty. Like, I just left something on a social media account from that I hadn't used for years, and it like has potentially date of birth on it. Date of birth, you have maybe something that's on like a company's house, and you can piece together very quickly, like, oh, that person has done this, and that's what I do. So I was kind of like, oh right, I get it. But I guess that meets on to like, if this happens to you, what's the immediate things to do? Like, is there anything that you would recommend generically that if something is happening that somebody could start to do, or where to go?
So our first piece of advice is always go to the police. And so that's a tricky topic because most of the time a crime is being committed. The sooner you can get that in front of the police, the better. But that's hard for a number of reasons. Some people are too embarrassed, or they think it might be a waste of police time, or they think they won't be taken seriously. And so, first up, usually going to the police is a really good action. Stopping communication and stopping following instructions from the scammer, the criminal, and the person they're talking to is usually good advice. Don't give them any more money. Don't click on anything else. Stop taking calls. Usually, if you can stop at that point and you can not trust anyone who phones you out of the blue and says, hey, I'm a police officer, we're going to move your money into a safe account, getting right back and having a think and giving yourself time to pause. I think the reality then is that you need some expert help, and I think that's what's missing. I think that's what we're trying to fill. If you are going to recover from your scenario, identity theft, that is actually, it takes a little bit of knowledge to understand, right, how have they done this? How do we build the evidence base that this wasn't you, that you can then go to these financial services that have been taken out and prove that it wasn't you? And also, how can we block further financial services being taken out? And there's various tools you can use there. So often getting good advice really quickly is the thing that will, A, lessen the impact. It will get you better outcomes, but it will also avoid you getting malicious help and being re-scammed again or re-victimized again. And again, because it's so broad, because someone's a revenge porn victim, someone's a cyber stalking victim, someone's been scammed, someone's had their email account hacked, the advice is just so varied, and it's why it's such a tricky area, and why we've had to work so hard to understand how do you respond to these different types of attacks.
Yeah, and I suppose it's taken years to build kind of those playbooks of, so because I'm guessing every week there's something new, and you're like, oh, we've kind of seen this before, so we think it's this, but we're going to have to work with you a bit on this because this is a new thing to us, because I'm guessing people are changing the things. They don't keep same attacks. They manipulate change and use new pathways to see what they can do.
Yeah, and I think what's amazing, if you think about what we've developed and the response pathways that we have, it's all been built by volunteers. And so this is just the cyber community coming together to saying, right, we need to work on this. We need to build this out. We need to monitor it. We need to change it and keep it up to date. And it is almost exclusively volunteers and people using their expertise and time. And what we see is new stuff all of the time. And so as that new stuff comes in, we have people who just need to go and reverse engineer it and say, is this just a different variation? Is this a new type of attack? What's actually happening here? And what is our advice? And so it's a continual evolution of trying to understand, how do you diagnose it? How do you remediate it? And how do you get that person feeling safe online again?
So, I mean, is there any proactive steps that people can do that, I guess, can I guess, mitigate or reduce the impact of these kind of things? I'm not saying avoid them, but things that they can do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I could take that from 2 points of view, maybe. One is, what could you do for yourself? And if you're a parent, what could you do that might make it easier with children in future? I think for yourself, the key thing is the real basics. And that's the really challenging thing. It's don't use the same password everywhere. It's, have good passwords, use a password manager. Two-factor authentication is probably the biggest thing. And using tools that make that easy, like Face ID or thumbprint, is usually, good enough advice for the general public. And my one thing would be, when you sign up to you have a new device, you sign up to a new account, just be curious about the security settings. And I know you just want to watch cat videos or, do whatever you want to do on that platform. But when you set that account up, just go in and have a look at what security features are there, because they're usually there. They're just not turned on by default. And that can go a long way. I think the second thing for individuals is just be really careful about what you share and who you trust. It's really easy to say, never share a naked photo of yourself. It's really easy to say, if someone phones you and strips, don't strip, because you don't know who they are. You shouldn't trust them. But people are going to do that. But generally, if you are going to share intimate content, do the work to trust that individual first as much as you can. Because as soon as you send that image, it's in the wild and you've lost control of it. And even if you do trust that person first up, that relationship might break down, and then that content might find itself online. And then that's a really tricky place to be. I think with, someone like me who's got, my oldest child is 11, we've just given him his first smartphone because he's gone to high school. I think the biggest thing is education. And so sitting down, being honest, having a conversation with children or with parents, grandparents, and saying, look, these are the things that might happen. No matter what happens, you can come and talk to me about it. And, we'll help without you getting into trouble. Because a lot of what we see coming into the helpline with younger people is them desperately trying to avoid telling their parents, never going to phone the police because they're 15. And they certainly don't want to go to their school. And so they're in this place where they need help, but where do you go? And so if you have a kind of open door policy where, if something happens maliciously online, you're scared of someone online, someone asks you for something that doesn't feel right, come and talk to me and we can help. That goes a long way. I think the second thing with kind of children and older people, I think, is there is, a lot of good technology out there now around, family Apple IDs, technology where you can control what children can see, how they can use their devices. So using some of those technologies also really helps limit the content that they might see and the content that they might share.
Thanks for that, Rory. So, we're moving to some, I guess, more of the standard bits that we always talk about, which is like, given what you've seen, what are your biggest concerns over the next 12 to 18 months in this space?
So I think that cybercrime is now over 50%. So over 50% of crime reported in the UK is cybercrime or cyber-enabled crime. It is the dominant part of how people get exploited now. My concern is that we, in terms of the police, in terms of the law, in terms of regulation, in terms of victim support, we are just not where we need to be. And I think, if the internet was 4 or 5 years old, I'd understand it. And I'd think, yeah, this is hard. We're trying to transition to a new model. But it's not. It's now 30, 40, 50 years old. And we haven't adapted to the online threat. And in particular, we haven't adapted to the online threat facing individuals. And I think if you look at some of the technologies that are coming online. We talked about them earlier, AI, large language models. I think that I worry about the volume, scale, and accuracy of attacks against individuals. And I worry about how prepared we are to help them, how prepared social media platforms and internet platforms are to provide support. And I also think on the other side, we have a lot of elections coming up over the next 12 months. I think how these tools and threat actors are manipulating what people believe and what is the truth, and also being able to turn groups of individuals against each other, and then that causes that online harassment, that cyber stalking, that malicious online behaviour. I think that we've got some big problems coming up, and I do wonder over time whether the level of anonymity that we have right now online is just unsustainable over time.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, like, there's so many things. We've had a guest on recently, and he's an ex-intelligence analyst for the US, and he said very, very similar things. As just like his biggest concern was elections, misinformation, how easy it is now. Like, you don't need to be particularly skillful to to know how to cause damage, because you can reverse engineer these things. There's technology which can do it for you. Yes, some of the models are putting behaviour in to stop it, but it's not difficult to go into the dark web and find specific things where you can circumvent all of this.
And think how terrifying this is. Historically, to be part of a sextortion attack or a revenge porn attack, you actually had to send a naked image of yourself, or you had to, take part in a sex act on a webcam. Now, someone just needs a video or a photo of you, and they can use AI tools to generate that content, which people believe is the real content. So you don't even have to have participated to be a victim of these attacks. And so I find that terrifying. And I think we need to find solutions to that and control this type of content before it gets online. As part of that kind of uploading, sharing process.
Yeah, it is scary, isn't it? I mean, you've seen the things that are coming with some of the new models and the video generation. I mean, that's used in let's say, the way it's intended to be used. But with all of these things, there's always unintended consequences of, it can do this. Well, people can turn off the things that you put in those models very easily if they have access to it.
Yeah, technology's great. And you look at large language models, you look at the technology, and, I used email and mobile phones, computers, really the first time when I went to university. And so you look at the technology there now and the potential applications for it, it's incredible. But for some reason, we are still in the place where we're releasing code, devices, online services without thinking about the risk and the threat to individuals. And too often when we are kind of thinking about risk models for solutions online, we're thinking about, nation state actors, we're thinking about, script kiddies who might, do a technical attack on these services. We're not thinking about an abusive boyfriend. We're not thinking about a parent who is controlling their child. We're not thinking about the threat actors that people are actually facing online. And so I think that lack of understanding of what the threat looks like for individuals means we just release these tools without really thinking about the real threat. And what happens over time, and AirTags is a really good example. And you release the technology where you can track people and you can just drop the tag and you can see where someone is. And then retrospectively, you then add the capability that it tells you there's an AirTag on you and it's not yours, so what's happening? But if we understood these models better of how these technologies might be used maliciously, that AirTags would have shipped with all the security functionality on day one. And so that's where we need to get to.
Yeah, it's the kind of secure by design concept, isn't it? And that's not just in the software that you produce being secure, it's how it's actually used and having a think of, well, have I built in, well, there was one, was it DHL with that chatbot? Did you see that?
Yeah, I did see that, yeah.
And I know it's slightly different, but they released it with all good good intentions, and someone just started asking it to swear at him and respond in that way, and it did, and it was like, all right, and you kind of like, and that's a multinational company putting something in, thinking about how it's being used, and not testing for unintended use cases, and that's just a person on a chatbot, not a person probably trying to cause issues who knows how to do this.
Yeah, and it's really easy when you build these tools to just have lots of faith in humanity that people will do the right thing that you want them to do with it. And, you know, we run a chatbot, has a diagnosis engine. People put weird things into chatbot. They see if they can break them. You know, that is just human nature. And I do think secure by design is where we want to get to, but we can't do that in the consumer space until we actually understand what is the threat model for individuals. And that's the gap. And I think that's where we have a real opportunity to say, well, here it is. You know, here's the attack framework for individuals. Let's all agree what this looks like, and then let's start protecting individuals before we release the technology to them.
So, can you talk me through then, like when you're looking for helpline responders, what does a great helpline responder look like? What are you looking for when you're bringing these people on?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we obviously want them to have the technical grounding. And so for us, they've usually got a degree in computer science and technology and cyber. You know, they're technical people with good qualifications. But that's only half the job. The other half of the job is, how do you deal with that individual who is in a really stressful position? And so you need to have empathy. You need to be able to communicate really well. And you also need to be able to deal with trauma to some extent, because you will be dealing with people who are having a really, really hard time. And so you have to be able to deal with that as you do your volunteering. So the big things for us are, one, they've got that technical grounding and they understand the area that we're in. Two, they've got those good communication skills, they've got empathy, and they are able to lead that individual confidently through. And three is they've got time, because it's really hard volunteering, because you get home from work and you want to have some dinner, switch the TV on and sit down and watch Netflix. But what we're asking people to do is, you know, get home, have dinner, flip the laptop up and take a case and deal with a victim of cybercrime. And so most of our volunteers are giving around 4 hours a week to taking cases, but also just generally being a volunteer at the Cyber Helpline. So that mix of soft skills, interpersonal skills, technology, and the time, that's what makes a successful helpline responder.
Perfect. So I'm going to wrap up with two questions, but the first one is, if you could have one thing in security that you could solve and it could stop, what would it be?
That is a really good question. I think I've got two answers here. I'm going to give you both, and then you can feel free to.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Look, it's a difficult question. A lot of people are always a bit like, "Oh, taken back by that one."
Yeah, it's really good. I think so. One is the international jurisdiction issue. So, you know, when we think about crime traditionally, you know, someone's stolen your car, they're probably in the same country as you, and you know, they're underneath the same law, and the police force has jurisdiction. The big problem that we have with cybercrime and online harm is that quite often those criminals are in a different country and they are outside of the jurisdiction of the police and the services here. They might still be in friendly jurisdictions like America or in Europe, but they're in a different jurisdiction. Most of the time, in that case, as soon as it looks like the perpetrator is outside of the UK, that cases just stop. In terms of police support, there's nothing they can do. And so if we could have a way for international justice for victims of cybercrime, I think that would go a really long way to solving the problem and giving people justice. It's also probably the hardest thing that you could achieve in cyber. The other thing is that I'm a big fan of privacy, but I do think anonymity online and the ability for one individual to run 50 Facebook accounts, it probably does need to come to an end. Now, whether your identity is shared publicly or whether there's just a know your client process by social media firms where if that profile commits a crime, that identity can then be shared with the police, something needs to happen where we understand who the people are behind these accounts. And that would also solve the problem of people running tens, hundreds of accounts, scamming people, harassing people, without any risk of being identified, essentially. Those two things together would make a huge difference.
Yeah, the latter one's a huge thing, isn't it? And the problem is you're asking someone who their North Star metric is the number of active accounts they've got to then police themselves to then go, oh, by the way, you need to clean up all of the bots, duplicate accounts, and introduce a verification thing, which I don't think any of them want to do because and it's difficult, isn't it? Because they're like, oh, we've got these active users, and that's kind of like their thing. You can market to these many people, and it's like, yeah, but I mean, I know there was the controversy with Musk buying Twitter when he basically said a third, and he probably wasn't wrong, of Twitter's users were bots, duplicates, and all kinds of other things. Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah, and they absolutely. So, what should these social media companies, big internet platforms do? They should work really hard to keep people safe. And if something goes wrong on the platform, they should provide help. Neither of those things is happening right now. And so the concept that will be done voluntarily and at the cost of the profits is really, really unlikely. And I think what you've seen with Twitter and X is that these verification schemes exist, the blue tick, but they were for famous people initially and really hard to get if you were just a normal person. Even as a charity, they were extremely hard to get. And then now it's a paid service where anyone can be verified with a pretty weak process. So these things exist. And if you look at the technology that's used in banking, for example, to look at, is this person who they say they are? And, you think about tools like adaptive access control, identity management, from their voice to the speed that they type, from their browser set, all these things that build a risk profile of, is this individual there? The technology largely exists for us to clamp down on malicious users, fake accounts, bots, but it costs money and it has to be put in place. Now, the banks do it because it saves them lots of money in fraud. The social media companies don't do it because there's no regulation and it doesn't help them make any money. So I do think that what will undoubtedly have to change is regulation and the rules that these platforms play by. And even a simple thing like a UK user on a social media platform who's had a crime committed against them on the platform having to apply to California to get the evidence through lawyers and intermediaries and that kind of international process just feels crazy. Why not just say, if you provide a UK service, data must be held in the UK and it must be available for law enforcement. But, it'll take us time to get there.
Yeah. Look, it's been a pleasure to have you on, Rory. I really appreciate it. Can you let the listeners know where they can hear from you more? Is there an email address, LinkedIn, websites that they can get in touch with you on?
Yeah, so the best place is the cyberhelpline.com. So that is our website where lots of information about us, lots of information about volunteering, fundraising, and obviously that's where all of our help sits and all of our advice and guidance. We're on all of the social media channels that you would expect, but going to the website will give you a really good feel for what our mission is and how you could take part.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.